One Detroit is coming up from the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History. We'll take you inside the new exhibit on Thomas Jefferson that has caused some controversy. You'll hear what public reaction has been and see the exhibit for yourself. Plus, the Detroit Civility Project, one conversation at a time. I'm Christy McDonald. Join me along with Nolan, Finley, and Stephen Henderson in Detroit. One Detroit is coming up.
Masco Corporation is proud to manufacture innovative and environmentally friendly products for the home. Delta faucets, craft-made in Merillat cabinets, and Behr brand paints have all been designed with you in mind. Masco and its family of companies, serving Michigan communities since 1929.
Support also provided by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, a partner with communities where children come first. The Cynthia and Etzel Ford Fund for Journalism at Detroit Public TV. The Detroit Journalism Engagement Fund, and by
Business Leaders for Michigan has 5 priorities to make Michigan a top 10 state. Achieve a balanced budget, cut long-term debt, fix our roads, improve all levels of education, further economic growth, plan for a stronger Michigan. How does diversity bring energy to us all? At DTE Energy, we believe that it's the contributions of all that build great communities. As a company, we grow stronger by welcoming the unique perspectives of everyone. As community members, we support our state's broad culture and heritage. From working closely with women and minority-owned suppliers to embracing our local cultures, DTE Energy is powering diversity. The DTE Energy Foundation is a proud sponsor of Detroit Public Television.
For nearly 100 years, Ally has been a part of Detroit, and we give back by volunteering and donating in our community. We have a commitment to diversity and increasing economic mobility in our hometown. At Ally, we're dedicated to doing it right every single day.
and viewers like you. Thank you.
Hi and welcome to One Detroit. I'm Christy McDonald. We're at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History with two stories. One about an exhibit here that's causing people to have some uncomfortable conversations. And then, how do you have those conversations with someone you disagree with? The first story, we'll take a closer look at the new exhibit here on Thomas Jefferson called Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello, Paradox of Liberty. We'll take you on a guided tour, then discuss. Then, how can we have conversations about uncomfortable subjects when we don't agree? More on Nolan and Stephen's Detroit Civility Project and the people taking the challenge to meet up and talk. It is all coming up. But let's get to the exhibit. Stephen took a tour with museum educator Doug McCrae and then had a bigger discussion about why this exhibit has caused some controversy and the feelings behind it on American Black Journal. Take a look.
Talk about the importance of this exhibit in this museum, in this city, at this time.
For me, the first thing that I learned once this exhibit was installed was that Thomas Jefferson had 600 people enslaved.
At his
now,
home.
before this exhibit was installed, I knew a bit about Sally Hemings, but I did not know about 600 people. So for me, the importance is that I now have 599 other people whose spirits I can pray for.
Mm-hmm. Whose names you might
Whose
know.
names might have known, yes,
Yeah.
or as they can be used as a source of strength to draw from the ancestors.
Yeah.
So those things, for me, make this exhibit very, very important.
You know, we're going to go inside in a little and look at some of the detail. I took a walk through and a couple things jumped out at me. One is the detail in there about the families, and slavery had an effect on those families. Their
Yes.
ability to stay together, the ability to grow, the ability to remember. This exhibit does a really good job of trying to put some of that back together where it got broken many centuries ago.
Yes, and that is incredibly important because in many instances that was the motivation for one person to escape and go to another plantation because one of their loved ones had been sold away. Mm-hmm. Or because they had heard about an impending sale. Mm-hmm. So that was reason, well, you know, we can't stay together, let's all escape. and many that may have been sold to another plantation, they would escape and try to go and find their loved ones.
So this is a pretty typical example of the exhibits inside the exhibit. These family trees, which give you such a really detailed picture of the people, the actual people, and how they related to one another on the plantation. This, of course, is the Hemmings family, which is kind of the center of all of that.
Yes, yes. And this one, I always say it's really, really informative. I have tried 2 or 3 times to follow it. I get lost every time. But it is still really, really interesting and important.
Yeah, okay. Let's go see more.
Okay.
So here we are finally at the statue of Thomas Jefferson. And this is one of the more controversial parts of the exhibit. But when you get here and see what's really going on, I think the context is really important.
I have spoken with people who have come here with the intention of being irritated, of being angry, despite what they see. And therefore, you don't really learn as much as you possibly can. People come here and they only see the statue. For me, 600 names. At the very top, as it says, remembering those enslaved. 600 names.
And it's kind of, I mean, the visual here is that this statue of the 3rd president of the United States is surrounded by these names of the people he owned. I mean, there's something very powerful about just the imagery itself.
Exactly. Even though we have here is only 600 names, I like to imagine if each one of those names had a child and they had a child and that wall was expanded, ultimately Jefferson would be completely hidden.
Yes.
And for me, that is an example of how unimportant he is to this exhibit about Sally Hemings and those people who were enslaved on those many plantations.
I think the exhibit, as all of the exhibits that we hope to present at the Wright, presents a variety of different access points and stories. This one happens to be grounded in Jefferson's Monticello, but it talks about everything from the Sally Hemings story, the enslaved people of Monticello, the artisans that created it, and then also gets into the issues of Jefferson's paradox, as they call it, in the exhibit, of having tried to reconcile in his mind how it was that he had 600, 900 enslaved people, and yet also is the author of the Declaration of Independence. So, you know, the exhibit, I think, for us, just allows us, you know, the exhibit is just a starting point for the discussions that we have at the Wright. There are a number of other talks and conversations that we have, public programs, et cetera. So all of our exhibits are designed to raise a variety of different issues that can be further investigated and discussed in that context. So I think it's important because it just raises a number of very complex, very difficult and challenging issues of which people should rightly agree and disagree about.
So Dr. House, before we get to your point of view here, I want to note that you were unable to even go into the exhibit because you feel so strongly about your objections to it. So tell us what that objection is.
It's not just my objections. It's the fact that our coalition is actually boycotting this exhibit. And so as a representative of that coalition, I wouldn't want to go into the exhibit, and I wouldn't want to lead people to think, oh, it's okay. You know, we're calling for boycott of, but it's okay if I go in. No, no. Our coalition has been involved with or expressing opposition to this exhibit long before it came. When we learned it was going to be brought here, we started to try to get to the museum board and say, no, this is a mistake. This isn't representative of what Dr. Wright envisioned when he fought so hard to found this museum. And we felt that it was a really sad use of limited museum funds to invest in bringing this museum. We think that this exhibit, we think the exhibit seeks to falsify the reality of slavery on the Monticello plantation by sort of wiping out all of the terror and violence that would have been necessary to keep 600 enslaved people working and laboring from sun up to sundown. We know that our people were ingenious, that they were creative, that they invented things, that they learned ways to endure the hardship, right? But this was a miserable life for them, and it's a falsification of their experience to have an exhibit like this that just whitewashes all of that reality out of it.
So it's hard to tell a book by its cover, right? And it feels like to me that the coalition critiques an exhibit that is not here. And I had Dr. House and her coalition taken the time to see the exhibit, and I understand your boycotting and why you would want to do that. You would notice that the right, knowing the audience and the place that we are in, did in fact reimagine this exhibit for Detroit. And one example of it is a simple tombstone that you see here that does not appear in any other representation of this exhibit anywhere, as well as the enslaved ancestors. That is the first images that you see when you come into this exhibit. It's about the enslaved people of Monticello. There's no question about that. You don't encounter Jefferson until 2/3 of the way through. And I think this was a response to some of the critique that the coalition was bringing forward.
We have to remember that Sally Hemings was a child, 12, 13, 14 at the most, when President Jefferson decided that she was going to be the bearer of his children. Some people say 6 children, some say 7. I know that one child didn't survive. So nowadays we would call Jefferson, President Jefferson, an enslaver and a pedophile, right? People are going to prison in our current society for being pedophiles, right? Yet we are willing, in this one institution that celebrates African American history, we are willing to bring in images of this kind of person.
And say hello to our contributors, Stephen Henderson of WDET and American Black Journal, and Nolan Finley of the Detroit News. It is good to see both of you here. And coming out of that conversation, Stephen, that you had, first taking us through the exhibit, and then really hearing the passion on both sides. And when you think about art and when you think about exhibits like this, really kind of evoking those kind of emotions on both sides.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the point of a museum like this, the point of exhibits like this, is to make people think, and maybe make them think in a way that's different than the way they thought before, and provoke some discussion and maybe debate and maybe some argument. There are people who don't agree with that about this particular exhibit. They think it's rendered in a way that glorifies a slaveholder and doesn't show enough of the brutality of the lives that those slaves lived. They also feel like the community didn't have enough say over whether this exhibit would come here or what it would look like. And I think those are all very valid points of view. But I do think if you go through the exhibit and see the thought that was put into it, it's hard to level those kinds of criticisms against it. I mean, it really does show an important part of the life of the slaves who lived at the Jefferson's plantation.
And that's really where the exhibit starts.
And that's where it starts.
And then it makes its way to Thomas Jefferson. Nolan?
Well, Steve and I were talking before the show. I mean, the truth is complex, and this talk about more enlightened and benevolent slaveholders somehow, or in some contexts, that's even worse than the brutal slave owners, because these people knew better. They knew they were dealing with spiritual human beings. I told the story about my hometown. There was a place called the Old Mulkey Meeting House, where there was a community of slaveholders and slaves, all attended the same church, and the slaves could bring their grievances against their owners to the church. They couldn't go to the court of law, but they could go to the church, and people say, well, this was, these were very enlightened people. I think they were worse because they knew better. They knew they were dealing with human beings and still enslaved them, still treated them as beasts of burden.
I think it's interesting, though, to take a larger look at the role that this museum plays in this community, in Detroit and in our area, about sparking those kinds of conversations that we should be having about our past.
Yeah, I think we should. Dr. Gloria House, who is the person who represented the opposing view in the interview, did make a great point, though. She said this, before the museum was opened in Washington, the Smithsonian African American Museum, this was the only museum of its kind in the country. And so it does occupy a pretty sacred space for people in the city, for African Americans around the country. And I think I could certainly feel a sense of offended sensibility on her part because of that this was not a community decision to do this. I think they feel left out, and they feel disrespected.
But this is not a museum that has taken slavery lightly. I mean, this has not been afraid to show the brutality of the slave trade. I mean, their original exhibit when they opened was just jarring. So, I mean, they should have earned the right to take different perspectives and to walk out on a limb a little bit.
And this is a temporary exhibit, though. Have they talked about how many people have come through and what the reaction really has been from the community?
There's an incredible number of people filing through here, and they have a board right behind Nolan over there where they've asked people to leave comments. It is full of things that people have written down about their reactions to this exhibit.
Well, you know, coming out of having hard conversations about race or politics, how do you have them with people you don't agree with? Well, that's been the basis of Nolan and Stephen's Civility Project, which the Detroit Regional Chamber launched at the 2019 Detroit Policy Conference, getting people who don't agree to sit down and to try to understand each other.
All right, the joy of civility.
February, the Regional Chamber Policy Conference. Shelby Scarborough kicks off the Detroit Civility Project.
What I'd like you to do is turn to the person to your left and to your right, and instead of saying, "Hi, how are you? My name is," I'd like you to turn to each other and say, "I come in peace."
Peace.
I come in peace.
I come in peace.
Nice
How you
to
doing
see you again.
Good to be seen.
We're talking about the ability
Trip was great.
on a one-to-one basis to be able to sit across a table from somebody who sees the world differently than you do and be able to have a conversation.
I started looking at this last night, and I might be impressed.
Madonna Van Fossen, white collar, North Oakland County. Tamuk Scruggs, blue collar, Detroiter. Oakland County Commissioners David Woodward, Democrat, and Mike Gingell, Republican. Margaret Allen, advocate for returning citizens, with Amy Hennis, corporate public affairs director. Their participants paired in a quest for civility, spending time in local coffee shops.
Stephen Henderson, I think his opinions are very much in line with mine. I've read in the past a lot of Nolan Finley stuff and been like, oh, that guy. That guy. And so when they sat down together and talked about the work they did to have a friendship, I'm like, how in the world?
It started on Detroit Public Television when Nolan had a show.
Welcome to Am I Right?
Town, and I would fill in sometimes.
Every time the economy showed a glimmer of hope, he would beat it down with another tax, another restriction on business.
I guess that's where we would disagree. Roosevelt did not ruin the economy in the 30s, he saved it, but we gotta move on. And we kind of got to know each other outside that context in some social contexts and found that we had some things that we both liked, bourbon being one of them, and bourbon maybe being one of the most important.
You started to develop a little bourbon snobbery. People are starting to treat it like wine, you know.
Nolan's a Kentucky native. Stephen worked at a newspaper there.
I mean, there's a big sort of cultural context to bourbon in Kentucky that's important. It's what they make. If you spend any time there, you become hooked. Both of us have been made better in the work that we do by the relationship we've been able to build, which, you know, is tense at times. Sometimes it is uncivil. You see it on TV when we get after each other.
Ask Chrissy.
That's not the same
J.
thing,
Edgar Hoover
Nolan.
thought they were.
No, he didn't.
So
no,
hang on.
You can't and we can get after each other when we really disagree, but there isn't a personal animus that you take away from that conversation about that other person. It's still Nolan, and I'm still Stephen, even though we bitterly disagree sometimes about things.
Even in our profession, even among political commentators, if you will, and opinion journalists, there isn't that much
interaction today. There's not that comfort level for people to have good, healthy debates and discussions. You look at the way our media has become bunkered on the cable news channels and on the internet. You have all conservative and you have all liberal, and they don't talk across the lines. They fight, and they call each other names, and they accuse each other of having all manner of bad intentions and motives. You're not seeing enough of these sort of conversations.
So what's the feedback that you've been getting since?
I've gotten a lot of really positive feedback. People saying, wow, that's really impressive that the two of you are working on that together. I get a lot of negative feedback too from people on the left who feel like civility is a call for them not to stand up and push back against.
It's a call for action. That sometimes in a world that you have to be uncivil to be able to get your point across in certain times.
We really want to have authentic conversations, but we really want to have brave conversations too.
Detroiter Lauren Hood does a lot of things. One is bringing people together to talk, really talk.
The term civility for me, it's triggering. It kind of sets a tone that says, we're not going to be authentic in here, we're going to be safe.
But yeah, we talked about this. It's cool.
Here, Hood leads a recent gathering called the Better Arguments Project. Although in sessions like these, there's not really supposed to be any arguing, and it's not just about being civil.
I'm really quick to point out that we're not talking about that kind of civility. We're not saying, how do you protest a violation of your rights? How do you push back against inequality? What we're saying is, when you're dealing with another person in your community who just happens to think differently, come to different conclusions than you do, how do you have a conversation with that person about that difference without it being uncivil? I mean, I think that's a different level of responsibility that we all have to be able to make the community better.
So I used to get all the time, well, what's the point of these conversations? They don't do anything. I'm like, no, I've seen it do something. I've seen it work. But everybody has to show up.
About 80 people have shown up for the Detroit Civility Project, pairing up to discuss differences and find things in common. Not just once, but getting together again and again to counter the incivility that always seems to be in the news from Washington.
Little pencil neck Adam Schiff.
I don't just think it's President Trump. I think it's the environment has become toxic. Everyone has to be on the attack. And if you're not on the attack, you get eaten.
I think the better term for what we're doing is listening. It's more like a listening project.
If you learn to discuss, if you learn to converse, if you learn to have very intense discussions and passionate discussions without taking away hard feelings, you could surprise yourself because you're more open to talking with people who don't hold your same views. You may learn something, and I think that's the point.
All right, both of you, besides looking at how you looked 10 years ago and some of that video.
I could have done without that.
Scary, right?
No. But the fact that so many people have stepped up now and they are getting together and having these conversations, you're starting a little something here, Nolan.
Well, we're anxious to see when we get to Mackinac at the end of the month. We're really anxious to see and hear from the people, these 80 people who went through the exercise, and whether it was useful, what they learned about each other, whether they came to some sort of respect for the other person's, if not agreement, at least respect that they're not ill-intentioned, they're not evil, they just think differently.
And you really have to try it before you say, oh, it's never going to work.
Well,
you have to be able to put yourself there to
Yeah.
sit down and to do the work.
Yeah, and I think there are some measures as to whether it's working. One is whether you agree to talk again, right? You walk away and say, this is someone I can deal with. The other is it uncomfortable? It should be. It should be difficult to talk about these things and talk about them frankly, not to shy away from the more controversial things, but to be able to do it in a manner that doesn't insult the other person or denigrate them.
And I think the next step is, besides people who may never meet again in their line of work, get down to the Thanksgiving dinner table with your family, the people that you have to see and you have to interact with all the time that you maybe have some fundamental differences with. But I can't wait to see it all, and we're just going to continue to follow it, and we'll have more stories on the Civility Project when we get up to the Mackinac Policy Conference, so stick with DetroitPBS.org for more. And finally, we here at Detroit Public TV are really excited about receiving top honors in the Detroit Society of Professional Journalists Excellent in Journalism Awards. One Detroit and American Black Journal will recognize for reporting on education, neighborhood revitalization, racial justice, returning citizens, and the environment. Plus, station CEO Rich Homburg received a Lifetime Achievement Award. Congratulations to the entire DPTV team. And you can see our award-winning coverage online. That is going to do it for us on One Detroit. Thanks so much to the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History for having us. And for more on the conversation about the Paradox of Liberty exhibit, watch American Black Journal on Detroit Public TV. I'm Christy McDonald. We'll see you next week. Take care.
Masco Corporation is proud to manufacture innovative and environmentally friendly products for the home. Delta faucets, craft-made in Merillat cabinets, and Behr brand paints have all been designed with you in mind. Masco and its family of companies, serving Michigan communities since 1929.
Support also provided by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, a partner with communities where children come first. The Cynthia and Etzel Ford Fund for Journalism at Detroit Public TV. The Detroit Journalism Engagement Fund, and by
Business Leaders for Michigan has 5 priorities to make Michigan a top 10 state. Achieve a balanced budget, cut long-term debt, fix our roads, improve all levels of education, further economic growth, plan for a stronger Michigan. How does diversity bring energy to us all? At DTE Energy, we believe that it's the contributions of all that build great communities. As a company, we grow stronger by welcoming the unique perspectives of everyone. As community members, we support our state's broad culture and heritage. From working closely with women and minority-owned suppliers to embracing our local cultures, DTE Energy is powering diversity. The DTE Energy Foundation is a proud sponsor of Detroit Public Television.
For nearly 100 years, Ally has been a part of Detroit, and we give back by volunteering and donating in our community. We have a commitment to diversity and increasing economic mobility in our hometown. At Ally, we're dedicated to doing it right every single day.
And viewers like you. Thank you.